The Spanish missions in California comprise a series of 21 religious outposts, established by Catholic priests of the Franciscan order between 1769 and 1833, to expand Christianity among the Native Americans northwards into what is today the U.S.state of California. The missions were part of a major effort by the Spanish Empire to extend colonization into the most northern and western parts of Spain's North American claims. Following a long-term secular and religious policy of Spain in Latin America, the missionaries forced the native Californians to live in settlements called reductions. The missionaries introduced European fruits, vegetables, cattle, horses, ranching and technology into the region that became the New Spain province of Alta California. However, the missions also brought serious negative consequences to the Native American populations with whom the missionaries and other Spaniards came in contact. Mexico achieved independence in 1821, taking Alta California along with it, but the missions maintained authority over native neophytes and control of vast land holdings until the 1830s. The Alta California government secularized the missions after the passage of the Mexican Secularization Act of 1833. This divided the mission lands into land grants, which became many of the ranchos of California. In the end, the missions had mixed results in their objectives: to convert, educate, and civilize the indigenous population and transform the natives into Spanish colonial citizens. Despite the fact that the original administrative system of Spanish missions no longer survives, still the impact that the mission system has had on California culture, economics, and place histories can yet be felt to this day. Today, the surviving mission buildings of the state's oldest structures, and its most visited historic monuments. Alta California mission planning, structure and culture. Founding prior to 1754, grants of mission lands were made directly by the Spanish crown, but, given the remote locations and the inherent difficulties in communicating with the territorial governments, power was transferred to the viceroys of New Spain to grant lands and establish missions in North America. The 21 Alta California missions were established along the northernmost section of California's El Camino Real, christened in honor of King Charles III, much of which is now U.S. Route 101 and several mission streets. The mission planning was begun in 1767 under the leadership of Fra Junipero Serra O.F.M. The Rev. Pedro Estevan Tapi proposed the establishment of a mission on one of the Channel Islands in the Pacific Ocean off San Pedro Harbor in 1784, with either Santa Catalina or Santa Cruz being the most likely locations. The reasoning being that an offshore mission might have attracted potential people to convert who were not living on the mainland, and could have been an effective measure to restrict smuggling operations. Governor José Joaquín de Ralaga approved the plan the following year. However, an outbreak of sarampion killing some 200 Tongva people, coupled with a scarcity of land for agriculture and potable water, left the success of such a venture in doubt, so no effort to found an island mission was ever made. In September 1821, the Rev. Mariano Pereira, Comisario Prefecto of the California Missions, visited Canada as Santa Isabel east of Mission San Diego de Ocala as part of a plan to establish an entire chain of inland missions. The Santa Isabel Asistencia had been founded in 1818 as a mother mission. However, the plans expanding beyond never came to fruition. Work on the mission chain was concluded in 1823, even though Serra had died in 1784. The Rev. Furman Francisco de la Suen took up Sarah's work and established 9 more mission sites. From 1786 through 1798, others established the last 3 compounds, along with at least 5 assistancias. At the peak of its development in 1832, the mission system controlled an area equal to approximately 1/6 of Alta California. Site selection and layout. In addition to the Presidio and Pueblo, the Misión was one of the 3 major agencies employed by the Spanish sovereign to extend its borders and consolidate its colonial territories. Assistancias were small-scale missions that regularly conducted Mass on days of obligation but lacked a resident priest. As with the missions, these settlements were typically established in areas with high concentrations of potential native converts. The Spanish Californians had never strayed from the coast when establishing the settlements. Mission Nuestra Señora de la Soledad was located farthest inland, being only some 30 miles from the shore. Each frontier station was forced to be self-supporting, as existing means of supply were inadequate to maintain a colony of any size. California was months away from the nearest base in colonized Mexico, and the cargo ships of the day were too small to carry more than a few months' rations in the holds. To sustain a mission, the padres required the help of colonists who converted Native Americans, called neophytes, to cultivate crops and tend livestock in the volume needed to support a fair-sized establishment. The scarcity of imported materials, together with a lack of skilled laborers, compelled the missionaries to employ simple building materials and methods in the construction of mission structures. Although the missions were considered temporary ventures by the Spanish hierarchy, the development of an individual settlement was not simply a matter of priestly whim. The founding of a mission followed long-standing rules and procedures. The paperwork involved required months, sometimes years of correspondence, and demanded the attention of virtually every level of the bureaucracy. Once empowered to erect a mission in a given area, the men assigned to it chose a specific site that featured a good water supply, plenty of wood for fires and building materials, and ample fields for grazing herds and raising crops. The padres blessed the site, and with the aid of the military escort, fashioned temporary shelters out of tree limbs or driven stakes, roofed with thatch reeds. It was these simple huts that ultimately gave way to the stone and adobe buildings that exist to the present. The first priority when beginning a settlement was the location and construction of the church. The majority of mission sanctuaries were oriented on a roughly east-west axis to take the best advantage of the sun's position for interior illumination. The exact alignment depended on the geographic features of the particular site. Once the spot for the church had been selected, its position was marked and the remainder of the mission complex was laid out. The workshops, kitchens, living quarters, storerooms, and other ancillary chambers were usually grouped in the form of a quadrangle, inside which religious celebrations and other festive events often took place. The quadrangular was rarely a perfect square because the missionaries had no surveying instruments at their disposal and simply measured off all dimensions by foot. Some fanciful accounts regarding the construction of the missions claimed that underground tunnels were incorporated in the design, to be used as a means of emergency egress in the event of attack. However, no historical evidence has ever been uncovered to support these assertions. Franciscans and Indians. The Alta California missions, known as reductions or congregations, were settlements founded by the Spanish colonizers of the New World with the purpose of totally assimilating indigenous populations into European culture and the Catholic religion. It was a doctrine established in 1531, which based the Spanish state's right over the land and persons of the Indies on the papal charge to evangelize them. It was employed wherever the indigenous populations were not already concentrated in native native pueblos. Indians were congregated around the mission proper through the use of means including forced resettlement, whereupon they were reduced from a perceived free, undisciplined state and ultimately converted into civilized members of colonial society. Their own civilized and disciplined culture, developed over 8,000 years of freedom, was not considered. A total of 146 friars minor, all of whom were ordained as priests, served in California between 1769 and 1845. 67 missionaries died at the posts, while the remainder returned to Europe due to illness, or upon completing the 10-year service commitment. As the rules of the Franciscan order forbade friars to live alone, 2 missionaries were assigned to each settlement, sequestered in the mission's convento. To these the governor assigned a guard of 5 or 6 soldiers under the command of a corporal, who generally acted as steward of the mission's temporal affairs, subject to the priest's direction. Indians were initially attracted into the mission compounds by gifts of food, colored beads, bits of bright cloth, and trinkets. Once a Native American Gentile was baptized, they were labeled a neophyte, or new believer. This happened only after a brief period during which the initiates were instructed in the most basic aspects of the Catholic faith. But, while many natives were lured to join the missions out of curiosity and sincere desire to participate and engage in trade, many found themselves trapped once they were baptized. To the padres, a baptized Indian person was no longer free to move about the country, but had to labor and worship at the mission under the strict observance of the priests and overseers, who herded them to daily masses and labors. If an Indian did not report for their duties for a period of a few days, they were searched for, and if it was discovered that they had left without permission, they were considered runaways. Large-scale military expeditions were organized to round up the escaped neophytes. Sometimes the Franciscans even permitted neophytes to escape to the villages, so that an expedition might be organized to follow them and in the process of capturing the fugitives, a dozen or more new Christians could be rounded up. On one occasion, writes Hugo Reed, they went as far as the present Rancho del Chino, where they tied and whipped every man, woman and child in the lodge, and drove part of them back. On the road they did the same with those of the lodge at San Jose. On arriving home the men were instructed to throw the bows and arrows at the feet of the priests, and make due submission. The infants were then baptized, as were also all children under 8 years of age. The former were left with the mothers, but the latter kept apart from all communication with the parents. The consequence was, first, the women consented to the rite and received it, for the love they bore their children, and finally the males gave way for the purpose of enjoying once more the society of wife and family. Marriage was then performed, and so this contaminated race, in their own sight and that of the kindred, became followers of Christ. A total of 20,355 natives were attached to the California missions in 1806. Under Mexican rule the number rose to 21,066. During the entire period of mission rule, from 1769 to 1834, the Franciscans baptized 53,600 adult Indians and buried 37,000. Dr. Cook estimates that 15,250 or 45% of the population decrease was caused by disease. 2 epidemics of measles, one in 1806 and the other in 1828, caused many deaths. The mortality rates were so high that the missions were constantly dependent upon new conversions. Young native women were required to reside in the monjerio under the supervision of a trusted Indian matron who bore the responsibility for their welfare and education. Women only left the convent after they had been won by an Indian suitor and were deemed ready for marriage. Following Spanish custom, courtship took place on either side of a barred window. After the marriage ceremony, the woman moved out of the mission compound and into one of the family huts. These nunneries were considered a necessity by the priests, who felt the women needed to be protected from the men, both Indian and Arakan. The cramped and unsanitary conditions the girls lived in contributed to the fast spread of disease and population decline. So many died at times that many of the Indian residents of the missions urged the priests to raid new villages to supply them with more women. As of December 31, 1832, the mission padres had performed a combined total of 87,787 baptisms and 24,529 marriages, and recorded 63,789 deaths. The neophytes were kept in well-guarded mission compounds. The policy of the Franciscans was to keep them constantly occupied. If the Indian would not work, writes C.D. Willard, he was starved and flogged. If he ran away, he was pursued and brought back. Bells were vitally important to daily life at any mission. The bells were rung at mealtimes to call the mission residents to work and to religious services, during births and funerals, to signal the approach of a ship or returning missionary, and at other times, novices were instructed in the intricate rituals associated with ringing the mission bells. The daily routine began with sunrise mass and morning prayers, followed by instruction of the natives in the teachings of the Roman Catholic faith. After a generous breakfast of athlete, the able-bodied men and women were assigned the tasks for the day. The women were committed to dressmaking, knitting, weaving, embroidering, laundering, and cooking, while some of the stronger girls ground flour or carried adobe bricks to the men engaged in building. The men worked a variety of jobs, having learned from the missionaries how to plow, sow, irrigate, cultivate, reap, thresh, and glean. In addition, they were taught to build adobe houses, tan leather hides, shear sheep, weave rugs and clothing from wool, make ropes, soap, paint, and other useful duties. The workday was 6 hours, interrupted by dinner around 11 o'clock a.m., and a 2-hour siesta, and ended with the evening prayers and the rosary, supper, and social activities. About 90 days out of each year were designated as religious or civil holidays, free from manual labor. The labor organization of the missions resembled a slave plantation in many respects. Foreigners who visited the missions remarked at how the priests' control over the Indians appeared excessive, but necessary given the white men's isolation and numeric disadvantage. Indians were not paid wages as they were not considered free laborers, and, as a result, the missions were able to profit from the goods produced by the mission Indians to the detriment of the other Spanish and Mexican settlers of the time who could not compete economically with the advantage of the mission system. The Franciscans began to send neophytes to work as servants of Spanish soldiers in the presidios. Each presidio was provided with land, El Rancho del Rey, which served as a pasture for the presidio livestock and as a source of food for the soldiers. Theoretically, the soldiers were supposed to work on this land themselves, but within a few years the neophytes were doing all the work on the presidio farm and, in addition, were serving domestics from the soldiers. While the fiction prevailed that neophytes were to receive wages for the work, no attempt was made to collect the wages for these services after 1790. It is recorded that the neophytes performed the work under unmitigated compulsion. In recent years, much debate has arisen as to the actual treatment of the Indians during the mission period, and many claim that the California mission system is directly responsible for the decline of the native cultures. Evidence has now been brought to light that puts the Indians' experiences in a very different context. The missionaries of California were by and large well-meaning, devoted men. Attitudes toward the Indians ranged from genuine affection to wrathful disgust. They were ill-equipped, nor did most truly desire to understand complex and radically different Native American customs. Using European standards, they condemned the Indians for living in a wilderness, for worshipping false gods and no god at all, and for having no written laws, standing armies, forts or churches. Mission industries. The goal of the missions was, above all, to become self-sufficient in relatively short order. Farming, therefore, was the most important industry of any mission. Barley, maize, and wheat were among the most common crops grown. Cereal grains were dried and ground by stone into flour. Even today, California is well known for the abundance and many varieties of fruit trees that are cultivated throughout the state. The only fruits indigenous to the region, however, consisted of wild berries that grew on small bushes. Spanish missionaries brought fruit seeds over from Europe, many of which had been introduced from Asia following earlier expeditions to the continent. Orange, grape, apple, peach, pear, and fig seeds were among the most prolific of the imports. Grapes were also grown and fermented into wine, for sacramental use and again for trading. The specific variety, called the Criolla Mission grape, was first planted at Mission San Juan Capistrano in 1779. In 1783, the first wine produced in Alta California emerged from the mission's winery. Ranching also became an important mission industry as cattle and sheep herds were raised. Mission San Gabriel Archangel unknowingly witnessed the origin of the California citrus industry with the planting of the region's first significant orchard in 1804, though the commercial potential of citrus was not realized until 1841. Olives were grown, cured, and pressed under large stone wheels to extract their oil, both for use at the mission and to trade for other goods. The Rev. Sarah set aside a portion of the mission Carmel Gardens in 1774 for tobacco plants, a practice that soon spread throughout the mission system. It was also the mission's responsibility to provide the Spanish forts, or presidios, with the necessary foodstuffs and manufactured goods to sustain operations. It was a constant point of contention between missionaries and the soldiers as to how many fanagers of barley, or how many shirts or blankets the mission had to provide the garrisons on any given year. At times these requirements were hard to meet, especially during years of drought, or when the much-anticipated shipments from the port of San Blas failed to arrive. The Spaniards kept meticulous records of mission activities, and each year reports submitted to the Father Presidente summarizing both the material and spiritual status at each of the settlements. Livestock was raised, not only for the purpose of obtaining meat, but also for wool, leather, and tallow, and for cultivating the land. In 1832, at the height of the prosperity, the missions collectively owned 151,180 head of cattle, 137,969 sheep, 14,522 horses, 1,575 mules or burros, 1,711 goats, and 1,164 swine. All these grazing animals were originally brought up from Mexico. A great many Indians were required to guard the herds and flocks on the mission ranches, which created the need for a class of horsemen scarcely surpassed anywhere. These animals multiplied beyond the settlers' expectations, often overrunning pastures and extending well beyond the domains of the missions. The giant herds of horses and cows took well to the climate and the extensive pastures of the coastal California region, but at a heavy price for the California Native American people. The uncontrolled spread of these new herds birds, and associated invasive exotic plant species, quickly exhausted the native plants in the grasslands, and the chaparral and woodlands that the Indians depended on for the seed, foliage, and bulb harvests. The grazing-overgrazing problems were also recognized by the Spaniards, who periodically had extermination parties cull and kill thousands of excess livestock. When herd populations grew beyond the control of the land's capacity, years with a severe drought did this also. Mission kitchens and bakeries prepared and served thousands of meals each day. Candles, soap, grease, and ointments were all made from tallow in large vats located just outside the West Wing. Also situated in this general area were vats for dyeing wool and tanning leather, and primitive looms for weaving. Large bodegas provided long-term storage for preserved foodstuffs and other treated materials. Each mission had to fabricate virtually all of its construction materials from a local materials. Workers in the carpentry used crude methods to shape beams, lintels, and other structural elements. More skilled artisans carved doors, furniture, and wooden implements. For certain applications, bricks were fired in ovens to strengthen them and make them more resistant to the elements. When Texas eventually replaced the conventional jackal roofing, they were placed in the kilns to harden them as well. Glazed ceramic pots, dishes, and canisters were also made in mission kilns. Prior to the establishment of the missions, the native peoples knew only how to utilize bone, seashells, stone, and wood for building, tool-making, weapons, and so forth. The missionaries established manual training in European skills and methods, in agriculture, mechanical arts, and the raising and care of livestock. Everything consumed and otherwise utilized by the natives was produced at the missions under the supervision of the padres. Thus, the neophytes not only supported themselves but after 1811 sustained the entire military and civil government of California. The foundry at Mission San Juan Capistrano was the first to introduce the Indians to the Iron Age. The blacksmith used the mission's forges to smelt and fashion iron into everything from basic tools and hardware to crosses, gates, hinges, even cannon for mission defense. Iron in particular was a commodity that the mission acquired solely through trade, as the missionaries had neither the know-how nor technology to mine unprocessed metal ores. No study of the missions is complete without mention of their extensive water supply systems. Stone zanjas, aqueducts, sometimes spanning miles, brought fresh water from a nearby river or spring to the mission site. Open or covered line ditches or baked clay pipes joined together with lime mortar or bitumen. Gravity fed the water into large cisterns and fountains, and emptied into waterways where the force of the water was used to turn grinding wheels and other simple machinery, or dispensed for use in cleaning. Water used for drinking and cooking was allowed to trickle through alternate layers of sand and charcoal to remove the impurities. One of the best preserved mission water systems is at Mission Santa Barbara.